Good evening. I want to welcome you to this opening keynote address for the 14th Flair Symposium on the theme Literature and Change. My name is Steve Ennis, and I'm director of the Harry Ransom Center. Over the next 2 days, novelists, playwrights, editors, reviewers, and educators will be considering what value a poem, a play, or story has, how literature shapes our inner lives, our understanding of the world around us, and what practical use it has. I'm delighted that we have Colm Tóibín opening this symposium, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him back to the University of Texas. Colm has had a long relationship with the university, including serving as a visiting faculty member at the Michener Center for Writers, and return visits for a number of special occasions over the years. Most recently, he joined a group of Ransom Center friends when we visited Dublin, and on that occasion read from his recent collection of poems, Vinegar Hill. Colm Tóibín is one of our most beloved contemporary writers, and each new novel of his is a major literary event. He was born in Enniscorthy, County Wexford, and while he has traveled far from those origins, that setting is a familiar one to readers of his novels. He read history and English at University College Dublin, and following his studies, spent several years as a journalist and has published a number of works of nonfiction. He's the author of 11 novels, including The Master, an imaginative rendering of the inner life of Henry James, which was winner of the Dublin Impact Award and the LA Times Novel of the Year. Author as well, the short story collection Mothers and Sons, and Brooklyn, winner of the Costa Novel of the Year. His 2012 novel, The Testament of Mary, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and a highly successful stage version followed, starring Fiona Shaw. Nora Webster won the Hawthornden Prize, and he followed that with House of Names and The Magician. In 2021, he received the prestigious David Cohen Prize. Long Island is a sequel to Brooklyn, which A.O. Scott describes as a story about the ordinary experiences of migration, marriage, and motherhood, filtered through an intense and meticulously observed inner life. He is currently Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. And this Flair Symposium, of which this is the opening keynote, continues the work of editor, writer, and artist Flair Coles, who convened interdisciplinary conversations on the arts and culture in the pages of the legendary Flair magazine, which she founded. A warm welcome to all of you who have joined us for these 2 days of conversation, and an especially warm welcome to Colm Tóibín.
For reading, we need, is this working? Yes. For reading, we need solitude. And there are times, perhaps this is one of them, when solitude seems both oddly necessary, but also hard, haunting, and uneasy. The English poet Philip Larkin invoked the pleasures of just sitting at night reading, under a lamp, hearing the noise of wind and looking out to see the moon thinned to an air-sharpened blade. But Larkin also knew that solitude comes at a price. Only the young can be alone freely. The time is shorter now for company, and sitting by a lamp more often brings not peace, but other things. And reading, like music, depends also on memory. Each sentence depends on the one before, and each image gets its resonance from the previous one. In a novel, the characters themselves have memories, a sense of the past that might not be openly invoked, but is constantly implied. In The Great Gatsby, for example, we are fully alert to Nick Carraway's background as we are puzzled by Gatsby's, even though the intensity of Gatsby's presence in the novel depends on desires that belong to the past. Most novels are rooted in things as much as in thoughts. In Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady, Isabel Archer's aunt, Mrs. Touchett, is the most worldly of characters. The life of the spirit has left her in peace. When she's asked what marriage is, her response is practical, direct, unsentimental. Marriage occurs, she believes, when two people wish to set up a house together. The drama in the novel that follows arises from two different interpretations of marriage. The first is almost spiritual. The second is about worldly goods, social appearances, manners. A novel demands change. It is greedy for transformations. At the very core of the fictional enterprise is the idea of opportunity, choice, chance, development, process, instability, and movement. If in Kafka's The Trial, someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K., then those lies will not be enough. They will have to be the cause of something, the arrest and trial of the suspect. Jane Austen's heroines do not concern themselves with remaining single. Madame Bovary was not content. At the very center of this literature of change is the figure of a house, an old house that begins to exert itself, or the move to a new house, or the loss of a house, or indeed the acquisition of a house. In 1918, as the poet W.B. Yeats in Ireland set to write an elegy for the son of his great friend Lady Gregory, the poem called In Memory of Major Robert Gregory, Yeats invoked the first two lines, the house he himself and his wife had acquired, which would be the first house that Yeats ever owned. And then Yeats began to people it, this house, this almost finished house. He peopled it before it was even finished, or before it was even fully repaired, and he allowed it to be haunted. His poem begins, now that we're almost settled in this house, I'll name the friends that cannot sup with us. These friends are discoverers of forgotten truth or mere companions of my youth. All are in my thoughts tonight, being dead. A few years later, a civil war broke out in Ireland. Yeats viewed it from the perspective of his own crumbling house as he contemplated the empty nest of a starling. The word he uses for starling here is the Old English word stare. The bees build in the crevices of loosening masonry. Once more, we're in the idea that he's in a house, and the house is under threat as much as indeed the body politic. And there the mother birds bring grubs and flies. My wall is loosening. Honeybees come build in the empty come build in the empty house of the stair. And the poem ends on this large-toned aphorism, one that might remain resonant to us for a while, and then the image once more of a house. The aphorism comes first. We had fed the heart on fantasies. The heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmities than in our love. Oh, honeybees come build in the empty nest of the stair. So many stories begin with a house. It is as though there cannot easily be a book unless there is first a house. And it is uncanny then sometimes to find elements and traces and clues still in houses. Houses in which certain texts, certain novels and stories were dreamed up and were then transformed. It was the house that came before the word. And if there has been change, if the house is lost or gone, sold off, knocked down, then its image, its afterglow, become all the more powerful as the poem or the story or the novel enters our imagination. We sometimes read and write as ways to recover, re-see, reimagine, replace, refind. It is as though there has been all along a movie showing images and moments and drama from our dream lives and from our memories and from what we might have imagined. And the task of the book, or indeed the writer, is to darken the room so that what has been flickering on the screen, the half envisaged, now becomes, even for a few seconds, fully apparent, totally real, there in front of you. Henry James saw fiction itself as a house. The house of fiction, he wrote, has, in short, not one window, but a million. There is a peculiar intensity in how James describes the New York houses that he knew as a child. Old New York, as he saw it, between the ages of 5 and 12 has remained still and frozen and perfect in his memory, even if the city itself had undergone enormous change. In fact, it was the change that disturbed him. It was the change that gave him the frozen images more exactly. It was the ground, old New York, that formed him. He was never to have a place again which would belong to him so fundamentally. Henry James would not possess another house until 1897, when, aged 54, he signed the lease on Lamb House in Rye, in England. The year before he purchased that lease, he wrote his novel The Spoils of Poynton, a drama about owning and losing a treasured house. And having signed the lease, James wrote The Turn of the Screw, about a lone figure attempting to make a home in a house already possessed. New York after 1855 became the site of Henry James's dreams. One of the site's most hallowed quarters was number 58 West 14th Street. First seen, he writes, during an afternoon with his father. It became our house, he writes, just acquired by us. The place was to become for me, and ever so long afterwards, a sort of anchorage of the spirit. His other anchor was his maternal grandmother's house in Washington Square. This was the house he gave to Dr. Sloper and his daughter Catherine in his novel Washington Square, that he began to serialize in 1879. And the following year, as he worked on Portrait of a Lady, he would also make his other grandmother's house in Albany become the house where Mrs. Touchett, the famous Mrs. Touchett, finds Isabel Archer precisely in the house. So those two houses, the grandmother's houses, became the houses in which it isn't merely that he set his fiction in them, it is that he rebuilt them, restored them, found them again, as though the process of change, the Washington Square one had disappeared, the Albany one had more or less, it wasn't being used by the family anymore, but that idea of losing them was what gave him the need not to merely use them for the purposes of putting his characters in them, but actually to somehow or other rebuild them, remake them so that they became real. Their dissolution became, I suppose, offered James the sort of urge, the desperate urge sometimes to remake. So in chapter 2, as we know, in Washington Square, James inserted a passage about the square itself and its environs, which strikes the reader as strange, almost clumsy, and unthinkable for the novelist who would go on to write, say, Portrait of a Lady. It was here, he writes, that your grandmother lived, in venerable solitude, and dispensed a hospitality which commended itself alike to the infant imagination and the infant palate. It was here that you took your first walks abroad. This is not Catherine Sloper he's writing about, or her father. It's the author himself, the novelist. It's Henry James inserting himself, Henry James, into one of his stories, which he didn't do anywhere else. It was here that you took your first walks abroad, following the nursemaid with unequal step. James here was prepared to disrupt the sacred seamlessness of his fiction, to evoke the square as belonging to his memory, his primary sense of himself, which could be brought back now only in words. The need was so pressing and urgent that he would allow such a paragraph to remain. Had it been about any other place, he would surely have removed it. He was claiming Washington Square for himself. But what he was doing, in fact, was registering the complexity of change, of time passing, of things disappearing. The house in memory, the house that has been demolished or erased, is not merely a vehicle for soft recall, for easy nostalgia. Using an old house in a poem or a novel, naming it even, taking back what has been lost is a process whereby rooms, space, once familiar, once full, become alive or almost so. Maybe they're there again. And these rooms are handed to other characters who have come now to claim them, as though much time has passed, or as though no time has passed. And this idea of time passing in resonant space, of course, will animate T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets, especially in Little Gidding, where he will write, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, and know the place for the first time through the unknown, unremembered gate, where the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning." Remembering, just remembering, is too easy, and evoking is too soft a word. These are ways of describing things that have stayed the same, that are not open and dynamic, not ready to be imagined and molded into place. I'm talking here about what has been lost or rediscovered, what remains alive nonetheless, and what that does to the imagination. Elizabeth Bishop has an unpublished poem, or a published poem she didn't publish in her lifetime, called A Short, Slow Life, about a house. She wrote many drafts of it in the late 1950s. We lived, there's a poem, in a pocket of time. It was close, it was warm. Along the dark seam of the river, the houses, the barns, the two churches, hid like white crumbs in a fluff of grey willows and elms, till time made one of his gestures. His nails scratched the shingled roof. Roughly, his hand reached in and tumbled us out. In the early 1950s, Elizabeth Bishop moved to Brazil. The beautiful setting for the modern house where she and her partner lived on a hillside in Petropolis is detailed in many of her letters. For example, in September 1952, she wrote from Brazil to her doctor in New York, "I still feel I must have died and gone to heaven." Domestic life at the new house became a subject for great amusement, as though it was a play Bishop was acting in. But she followed one vivid and gorgeous description in a letter to Robert Lowell with an observation that anyone who comes from a northern landscape will recognize. "But oh dear, my aunt writes me long descriptions of the fall colours in Nova Scotia, and I wonder if that's where I shouldn't be after all." Once Bishop began to live in Brazil, she was interested in escaping history, or evoking it only as a way of allowing it to fade, dissolve, or forming an ironic, almost amused response to it, minimalizing its power and force. Bishop was a poet whose physical surroundings entered her spirit. Thus, in the early poems which deal with Brazil, there is a new sort of a new sort of imagery emerges, which takes its bearings from property and from rights. Squatters' children, the children stand among the mansions you may choose out of a bigger house than yours. This bigger house may be the world or the wider society. In any case, its lawfulness endures. Its soggy documents retain your rights in rooms of falling rain. So it's not merely the house, but the documents, the ways you can prove the ownership of a house. And she creates her rooms then, her houses, in order to watch them crumble and disappear, or in order to watch them become empty. In the village, her story written in Brazil about the time in her childhood in Nova Scotia when her mother disappeared, was taken to an institution, and one section of the story begins, "Now the front bedroom is empty." This is soon repeated. "The front room is empty. Nobody sleeps there. Clothes are hung there." And soon Bishop writes a poem called Sestina to invoke that house from which her mother had been taken. One line of each stanza will literally end with the word house. And the poem itself finishes with the image of the child making drawings, another inscrutable house. In the last volume of poetry she published, in a poem called The End of March, Elizabeth Bishop invoked a house, what she called my proto-dream house, my crypto-dream house. That crooked box set up on piling, shingled green, a sort of artichoke of a house. I think this belongs to common experience, the idea of one day, 1 year, going for a walk in some remote place on a beach or in another country and just seeing a house, a hidden house, and thinking, that's the proto-dream house, the crypto-dream house. That is the house where I will be happy, if only I could get my hands on the house. So she describes the imagined perfections, and she said, there must be a stove, there is a chimney. And then she imagines her life there. I'd like to retire there, which I think is, again, something perhaps we all feel, perhaps even at the moment more than any other time. I'd like to retire there and do nothing or nothing much forever in 2 bare rooms. It is an ideal, this dream house, in all its quirky detail, and then it, or the poem, slowly becomes real. And just as the word perfect, she thinks about a light to read by, perfect, it dissolves. It is impossible. And that day the wind was much too cold, even to get that far, and of course the house was boarded up. In the fiction of Henry James and the poems of Elizabeth Bishop, there is very little about the body, the human body. That the body might age and change is somehow taken for granted, just as history and political change are taken or almost taken for granted. Henry James published his first books after the American Civil War, just as Bishop published her first volume of poetry after the Second World War. They wrote in a time of relative peace. change for them, for the most part, was not political change. And there are many descriptions of the toll, and there are not many descriptions of the toll that time takes on the body. Nor is change seen as inevitable. You know, the way people say change was inevitable. Change in James, as in Bishop, is a wrenching process. And it is registered most acutely and dramatically through what happens to houses and what happens to people in houses. It is not merely that these writers deal with people who move house a lot or who treasure a house they live in. Rather, it is at the very notion of a house, its contours, both visible and strange, its palpable life, how light gets in and how shadows fall, become not just a metaphor for solidity or fluidity, for time, for change, but it is the fulcrum, the very emotional vehicle, the engine for how change is dramatized and registered. Before Bishop can dream of that house in her poem, The End of March, the proto, I don't know why I love it so much, the proto-dream house, the crypto-dream house, she will write her famous poem, One Art, the poem that begins, The art of losing isn't hard to master. And so she will try and describe all the things that she's lost, and she will enumerate them. She'll begin, of course, easy things, you know, door keys she's lost, and then time badly spent, and then her mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. In this poem, she doesn't mention the loss of her parents, or as a child, or the loss of her partner who had died. The houses were in Key West and in Brazil. And one of them was evoked in her poem, Song for a Rainy Season. Hidden, oh hidden, in the high fog, the house we live in, beneath the magnetic rock. The verb in her poem, One Art, for what happened to the 3 loved houses is interesting. They went, as though they could move as time could, as though they were active, willful forces. They weren't sold, they weren't knocked down. In her descriptions of them in letters and poems, they have a life of their own, just as the poet herself is registered as strangely helpless. The house is a form of energy, light and dark. In 1908, when he was 65, Henry James published a story called The Jolly Corner, which was his last great piece of fiction. And in the story, Spencer and James's titles for his names for characters got worse as he went on. I mean, who was ever called Spencer Bryden? Well, this man was. And he came back from Europe to New York after many years, and he owns an apartment still. He's kept all the years, which is, again, I think, out of all our dreams, that some house, some grandmother, some aunt, someone owned, or some rooms you had, you kept them all the years. You got someone to keep them clean, and you could go back there anytime you wanted, except you didn't. The woman, I love the name of speaking of names, the name of the woman who cleans the house every week in James's story is called Mrs. Muldoon. So it's nice to see the Irish getting in some way into this Spencer Bryden moment. And anyway, this is the house from which he's been absent, and he realizes in this story that he's double. His alter ego, the part of him that has remained at home, is also to be found in these old rooms at night. And he too, the double, is prowling. And the 2 men do battle. The ghost overpowers the visitor with a rage of personality before which his own collapsed. James himself had returned to New York after a long absence in 1904, and in the sort of poetics of change, as much as the politics of change, the way he deplored how New York has changed. For him, it was a very civil village with sort of Union Square, Washington Square, and bits of Broadway. But the idea of the skyscrapers, of the numbered streets, he couldn't believe the streets were like a ledger, he said, with all the numbers on them, you know, First Avenue, Second Avenue, Third Avenue. And he also believed that the avenues should have gone in the other direction. They should have gone east-west, thus letting more light in than them going north-south. Anyway, he deplored, there was nothing about the city. He deplored the Italians, he deplored the Irish, he deplored the new Jewish population. He deplored every single thing he saw. This idea of change fundamentally unsettled him. And this is now what's being dramatized, that he has come back to a city which in fact he has not left. And that in these rooms, which he has kept intact, which he has owned all the time, as I say, Mrs. Muldoon has been involved. Mrs. Muldoon says, I mean, she's very much one of those Irish witch figures who comes in to say, oh, I wouldn't go into that house after dark. And of course, he hasn't, the house has no system of lighting. And just a tiny detail, his best friend in New York is called Alice Davidson. Of course, the word Alice becomes one of the crucial words for James, because not only is his sister Alice James, but his sister-in-law, William's wife, is also Alice. So he puts the word Alice in one of his last stories, gets the word Alice as the woman figure in the story. And the most interesting sources sometimes for writers are often the hidden ones, and the ones that come into being gradually, almost autonomously. So, as I say, in most of the story, Spencer is alone. The ghostly house was where, quote, he had first seen the light, in which various members of his family had lived and died, in which alienated then for so long a period had, through the successive deaths of his two brothers and the termination of old arrangements, come wholly into his hands. So it's like the child lying in bed. What would happen if everyone died? What would I own? Well, you would have this house. So this man that James is imagining into being, he himself begins to imagine another presence in the house. His gaze, Spencer's gaze, is what animates him. His energy is in his face and in his eyes. The scarce light, the grey light, the crepuscular light are essential elements in the atmosphere that becomes increasingly autonomous and uncanny. And it seems as though the presence indeed might be his own actual double, that Spencer is haunting his own house as much as Henry James is haunting his own memory. Or this atmosphere is so filled with echoes of the dead that Spencer experiences its density as a kind of eeriness. He feels, and it isn't just that this is constantly being generalized, it becomes very particular at a certain moment in this story, The Jolly Corner, when he feels in his hand the old silver-plated knobs of the several mahogany doors which suggested the palms of the dead. In other words, the house itself, in a beautiful concrete image. James is attempting to depict someone of his own age who had also known the strangeness of return. Spencer begins to ponder on his own doubleness. It comes over me that I had then a strange alter ego deep down somewhere within me. And goes on then to say we are given some intimations about Spencer's past in the story. I believe I'm thought in 100 quarters to have been barely decent. I've followed strange paths and worshipped strange gods. I was leading at any time in those 30 years a selfish, frivolous, scandalous life. And again, this is Henry James imagining the life that he might have lived in Europe. Instead of being the most respectable man in London, all the other parts of him. He's also, of course, paying homage to his friend Robert Louis Stevenson, who's long dead by this time. And I mean, there's one of the possible origins of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the play on the name Henry James. You know, Jekyll, Hyde, J.H., Jekyll as Jacques. So anyway, he begins as him now alone, moving in these rooms. They come to resemble some watery underworld. James's character is all heightened consciousness. He's doing what the author is doing. The character is doing what the author is doing. He's dreaming another man into existence until the other man emerges from shadow into substance. He sees him. He sees him materialize from the penumbra, dense and dark. He is a figure framed in dark space, appearing from the grey, glimmering margin, the central vagueness. It gloomed. James is great. It gloomed, it loomed. This is James. It gloomed, it loomed. It was something. It was somebody, the prodigy of a personal presence. I mean, imagine if you could write that now. And then it becomes clear that it is a man of his own substance and stature waited there to measure himself with his power to dismay. And he suddenly realizes that the man is like him in every possible way. Except, of course, the man who stalks the room has in certain ways the face of a stranger. And so he doesn't see himself. But what he sees is that the man is missing two fingers. And it isn't as though the man is entirely different, but he's not entirely the same, and the difference is fully mysterious. And it occurs to Spencer, as I say, that there was the face of a stranger. Now, Henry James himself could, in fact, haunt houses. He had friends who lived in Italy called Lizzie Boot and her father, Francis Boot. Francis Booth was rich from New England. He was a sort of dilettante composer. But father and daughter were a fixture in the Italy of that time. James had known them in Boston, and he renewed his relationship with them in the 1870s in Italy. And it wasn't as though they were his closest friend, but there was something about them that made him use that configuration, father-daughter, father-daughter with the father is a widower, there's only one child, and she is a daughter, will come up in what? In Washington Square, in Portrait of a Lady, and in The Golden Bowl. And what's fascinating about this is how much it depends on the relationship, not to these people as much as to their house. So when he saw the apartment first, in the apartment they had in Bella Sguardo, which is the hill overlooking Florence in Italy, he actually wrote how pleasant it might be to live in that grave, picturesque old house, and added the following: I have a vague foreboding that I shall someday. Now, this reads like a throwaway remark because it probably was just a thing put into a letter. It's only in retrospect that it really comes alive. Lizzie Booth, whom this configuration, this idea that there was a widower living outside Florence with his daughter, and this will become, as I say, a significant feature in 3 of James's most important pieces of fiction. And it seems as though James, in staying with the Booths, in getting to know them, in writing regularly to them, that he studied the father and daughter and transformed them into characters in his fiction. Now, some years ago in Florence, I found somebody who agreed to show me precisely the apartment where Lizzie Booth and her father had lived in that big house on the hill in Bella Sguardo overlooking Florence. It's the Bella Sguardo sits above the city. As I said, the villas are studded into the hill. They have a view of the city and the Arno Valley below. At the top of the hill, there's the Villa Castellani, which from the front looks like a barracks. But the house was divided into apartments now as much as then. And the one inhabited by the Booths is on the first floor. Now, it's hard to say if it has changed much from the time the Booths lived there. They probably left it in about 1890. But it's easier to describe the shock and amazement I felt on entering that ample apartment to realize that it was the apartment precisely described as that of the fictional character of Gilbert Osmond and his daughter Pansy in Henry James's novel Portrait of a Lady. In other words, you walk into that large room, the door into the garden, the way the shadows fall is precisely as James describes it in Portrait of a Lady, and you can see it now, and it's still there. James wrote the imposing front had a somewhat incommunicative character. It was the mask, not the face of the house. It had heavy lids but no eyes. The house in reality looked another way. And so he gives big descriptions of the way in which the part of the house that faces onto the square looks like a barracks, but the other side is very soft because it looks down into the valley, onto the Arno Valley. But the actual description of the walking out of the door, where in the novel Pansy walks out, in the novel Madame Merle walks out after her, where thus leaving Osmond and Isabel inside, is one of the most uncanny moments where you think it's not merely the doorway, but the garden beyond, as described by the novelist, so James, as I say, he had used this first, oddly enough, in Roderick Hudson, this actual apartment, which was published in 1875, and this idea, the place I visited, walking from the principal room into the garden, that it had been, as I say, literally and precisely taken. So what I'm trying to suggest is for James thereafter, I mean after his own writing about them, even first in Roderick Hudson, secondly in Portrait of a Lady, that they were not merely haunted by the characters he had made, Gilbert Osmond and his daughter Isabel Archer, Madame Merle, but by the very people whom James had known who had lived there, Francis Booth and his daughter Lizzie, and after 1886, Lizzie's husband, Frank Tóibín, the American painter. While James was friends, as I say, with Francis Booth, the father, and the daughter, and he was on good terms with Tóibín, the painter, there's nothing special about their relationship that should have caused him to write another novel about a configuration such as theirs, which he did in his last great novel, The Golden Bowl, which deals intensely with the relationship between a father, a rich American widower, and his only child, a daughter who is about to get married. It was as though those very rooms in Bella Sguarda, the rooms I visited, once peopled by the Boots, then by the fictional characters in Portrait of a Lady, had once more yielded up some set of powerful images for James. The house became solid and stable, rather than something remembered or imagined. By invoking the rooms in such detail, the light, the doorway, the garden, the shadows, James had locked them in to his own imagination. Released were the characters who had led them there, who were transformed and changed into the protagonists of the Golden Bowl. To write the catalogue essay we're still back with that idea of space and wandering in space. And so I want to just invoke the T.S. Eliot thing, if you came this way, taking any route, starting from anywhere, at any time or any season, it would always be the same. You would have to put off sense and notion. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity, or carry a report. You're here to kneel where prayer has been valid. On Sunday, 16th of October 2016, I went to Reading Jail, an hour outside London, to the cell where Oscar Wilde was held between 1895 and 1897. The old Victorian prison building was about to be sold by the state. Now, until a few years before, Reading Jail had been used as a jail, as an active jail, for what are called young offenders. And we can see the sort of Victorian configuration with the corridors. So Wilde was held there in total isolation. First he was in Pentonville and Wandsworth, and then he was in Reading Jail. He was moved there in November 1895. He slept on a plank bed with no mattress. He was allowed 1 hour's exercise a day, and he couldn't sleep. He was permanently hungry, and he suffered from dysentery. And for the first month, he was tied to a treadmill, and when Major Nelson was asked by one of his friends, how was he, just said simply, he looks well, but like all men unused to manual labour who receive a sentence of this kind, he will be dead within 2 years. Wilde was later to praise Nelson, who had arrived at Reading as the most Christ-like man I ever met. Because Nelson did something absolutely extraordinary. He came up with a plan. Wilde obviously was in his cell alone. He had a Bible and very little else. He couldn't read, and he obviously couldn't write. He wasn't given any writing materials. And Major Nelson came up with a plan that prison rules said that you could write a letter. So it doesn't say how long the letter could be. So what if you could just write and write and write? All you needed was the name of the person it was to be addressed to, and then you could get the paper every day, be taken away every evening, brought back the next day, and you could write it and write it and write it. And if you were still writing it at the end of your time in prison, then it could be given to you when you were leaving. So in the dim light of his prison cell, with the memory of his suffering fresh, Wilde began to change. It was as though he sought a new sort of tension between breathlessness in his prose and breath control. And De Profundis, which is the name of the work he wrote, which begins as a letter but includes many other matters, is certainly not only his greatest prose work, but one of the great prose works of that age. It's the work of a mind in crisis, a writer in flux. It's a cross between an intimate address filled with accusation and urgent statement. And it's just being in that space. And the job I had in that space was to get locked into his cell and to read De Profundis out loud that would be live streamed in the church, and to try and find a sound for it, a tone for it, to imagine what it would be like in that hushed space, in the almost no light, for somebody to begin to address not only the person he's writing the letter to, but actually address many other matters that had puzzled him or that he had been certain about before. But he would change. He would change his attitude towards, for example, seriousness. He would change his attitude towards authenticity. He would change his attitude towards sincerity. And he would do that slowly each day, the things taken away, the night alone, the pages brought back. But the view, one of the extraordinary things looking from, everything had changed because the room had been remade as a place for young offenders. It was still a tiny cell. It was even frightening being locked in there for that time. But the view of the sky from the small window and the heaviness of the door brings you back to how Oscar Wilde, one of the great spirits of the age, broken in body and soul, and then restored to some dark proximation of life by being given pen and paper so that he too could lighten his sorrow or make it matter more by producing something as strange and beautiful as the prose work in De Profundis. This cell I was in, was the place where things changed. It returns us intensely to the matter, perhaps too intensely, to the matter of solitude. What our lives mean depends sometimes on the quality of our solitude, what it is like for us when we're alone. So this idea of Wilde alone in his cell, or Henry James walking into those rooms in Bellasguardo, or Elizabeth Bishop walking along that beach, thinking about where she might live, how she might imagine living. These are, I suppose we could call them a sort of cauldron of possibility, the place where the literary life, the life of the mind, might begin. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I think we've got 2 microphones. So if anybody, it doesn't have to be a question. If you've got any comment or to make, that would be great. If someone would start, it'd be even better. Oh, great. Here's somebody. We have a microphone over here, too.
I'm just acting out.
All right. All right. Even if somebody wants to shout. Great.
Hello, that was lovely. I don't want to take you too literally, but I'm 42, I'm a writer, I've never owned a house. I don't know that I'll ever get to. And I just wondered, in light of what you were just talking about, how you think the housing crisis, or let's just say the changing relationship that younger people have with property, might change or be changing literature.
Yeah. Well, I just when I'm talking about James seeing that house or that apartment on Bellasguardo, which he first visited, I think, in 1874. James did not own a house at that time, and in 1897 he signed a lease on Lamb House. It was a 20-year lease. But he didn't buy the house until later. So that James was constantly talking about himself as homeless. No, he didn't use the word homeless, but houseless. And that he was someone who was wandering. He always rented in his place in Kensington for all the years he was renting. And so that's why the fixation on houses becomes more important. That William James, his brother, was already living in a house. The whole idea of getting your own house, in these years especially, if you were a bachelor. And I think this is an important matter where the others were married. How does a bachelor get a house, and why? When Henry James signed the lease on Lamb House in 1897, his brother William wrote to him saying, "Why do you need a house? Like, who are you? And are you not spending too much money? Are you not just a foolish one?" And it was the same with Yeats. When Yeats begins to, when he buys the tower, which he has to renovate, it's because he's just married. And he's married a very rich woman. And they're using George Hightley's money to renovate the tower that will become the famous symbol in his poem. Once the poem is written, and once his book, The Tower, comes out, which I think is about 1928, in other words, he doesn't go back there again. He closes the place up when his daughter, years later, says, "I'd like to see it." They snap at her saying, "No, it's closed." And the family donates it to the state in the 1960s. But he used it. He wanted the house for a certain purpose. He got the house, but once he almost had the house, he couldn't stop himself writing a poem. "Once we're almost settled in our house." But he hadn't got the house yet. But, in other words, Henry James was in his 50s before he signed the lease for Lamb House. So too Yeats was in his 50s. But that's one of the reasons why they become so concerned about the small matter of houses, in that they actually don't have one. And everyone around them does. And so that I'm not suggesting that the housing crisis is good for a young writer or a middle-aged one, or for anyone at all. But it is possible that imagining a place where you might have lived, where you might have been, that might actually be something that you could use. But I still wouldn't wish it on anyone.
So to that question about the house and how we live today and the housing crisis, I wonder, sort of thinking about all of these inspirations for James and all of these pressures and desires and how it creates his body of literature. What inspires you about the contemporary pressures on young writers? I think we're all curious where literature will go, right? There's so much happening in the world. There's so much change. Like, what do you think the pressures now? Whether it's something small, like the want of a house, or it's something big, like a war, what do you think some of the major and minor themes that are creating real, rigorous creativity in young writers these days?
I think the question with narrative fiction remains what to do with chronology in narrative fiction. Can you tell a story that starts at A and that moves along in an orderly fashion as though something was caused by something else that will result in something else? Or the whole idea of beginning, this was something that really the whole 20th century tried to work out in one way or another as to, can you actually use a single style? Can you use a single perspective? Can you use a chronology that moves, as it were, chronologically? Or is there something in the air that forces you to begin a story at its end, in the middle, or somewhere else, to allow another character to intervene? I think those questions of style, irrespective of the time we're living in, but because of the state we're in relation to the tradition we've inherited.
Right.
Is there anything we can do where form isn't an experiment, or form isn't something we must push and push and push? Or is there some way we could finally accept the idea that a story moves singly, or a story has 10 different types of, 10 different layers? So I wonder if we're just back with technical problems, which actually, I think, mean everything.
Yeah.
But that do end up reflecting whatever the other crisis is, which is a crisis in language and a crisis in basically a political crisis.
Are there writers that give you hope, stylistically, rigor-wise, sort of just being able to sort of actually stay the course in terms of thinking about what good writing is rather than just reacting?
I suppose there are two that just come to mind. One would be William Faulkner, the efforts just to keep moving the times around and the perspectives. The other would be Toni Morrison.
But alive.
What?
Alive writers.
Oh, alive right now.
I mean, yes, yes,
sorry,
all day to
sorry,
Faulkner and Morrison.
I have to say that I don't, that idea of who's alive and who's dead, if you're a reader, isn't really that important. If a writer dies, it's not. But in Ireland, I think there's a young writer called Claire Keegan, who has shown the possibility of how the effort to suggest that something is simple by using a simple style might be a way of allowing in immense complexity, certainly about consciousness, about who knows what and who doesn't. So I think she's had an extraordinary influence on everybody, really, to show there's a way to go backwards in what looks like something old-fashioned.
And concisely.
What's it?
And concisely.
Yes. Oh, yes. And 100 pages. Show us all that you can do it in 100 pages. But I suppose that she has been really exemplary in the way that she's written, and so she would be somebody I would when I got an early copy of Small Things Like These. You'd find I had it read within 2 hours. It was so exciting to see what she'd done. And it's my territory in the sense that I'm, where she set the story is just 20 miles from where I'm from. So when she says something about, and escorty accents, I was able to say to her, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly how we talk, So.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to listen to you. While you were speaking, I thought of one of your early books called Blood, about walking the border soon after the agreement. And I know it was a while ago, but I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that experience and what kind of rose up out of that might meet the moment where we are now.
In the summer of 1986, I walked along the Irish border, starting up at Derry and going around where I would end at the Irish Sea. It was the summer after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which in fact had increased tensions within Northern Ireland. So you had any number of armies. Besides all the, there were still customs sheds because it was before the opening of the border after the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. So that you had, just think about the British Army. You had then the police force known as the RUC. You had the Irish Army. You had the Irish police force known as the Gardaí. Then you had the UD. I'm not going to go on, but there were on the what so-called Protestant side, one group of terrorists, and then on the Catholic side another group of terrorists. But also in the middle of the whole thing was a group called the UDR, who were official police, but they were part-time, meaning they were just as dangerous as anybody else. So the strange thing about walking was that people were more afraid of me than I was of them. Because the strangest, a lone male figure in the landscape moving slowly towards your remote house is not something anyone relished. And the only explanation I could offer was the truth. I am a journalist. I am writing a book about the border. I am walking along the border. And people would just think, that made absolute sense to them in a way that nothing else would. The advantage I had was that I had a very bad map, and everybody, including British soldiers, would say, but that map is wrong. And then we would get into conversation. Some of it was really funny. I mean, it is, there were music festivals, there were all sorts of events, including, indeed, the 12th of July. And someone told me, you're the only Catholic who's ever slept a night in that town. But the answer to that was, I'm from the South. I don't, the two societies had moved away from one another to the extent that I never felt like a Catholic against Protestants. I didn't have that. And there were times when I was with people who were Protestants where I felt not only sort of an affection, but a certain idea that whatever was happening was wrong. And I'm not good at that. I'm not a moralist. I'm not good at knowing what's wrong, but I sure knew that was wrong. And there was one particular moment where I turned up to see a man called Bob Bain. And Bob Bain was in a part of South Armagh. He was a Pentecostal. It was a born-again Christian, a very small sect, Bible reading, living. They were using a sort of prefabricated church. They were poor farmers, but they'd never been in the Republic of Ireland, and they were. I suppose their Protestantism was a very serious matter for them. It was fundamental in the sense it was both political and religious. And I turned up. And the church had been shot up, meaning on a Sunday afternoon, it would be early 1980s. The INLA, the Irish National Liberation Army, meaning they were a more diehard group than the IRA, had gone to the church and had shot through the wood, and had killed people at worship. And I don't know what I don't worship myself, but I did think there was something about this. So I went to see him, and he said, just come to the ceremony. So I sat in the church with those people whose relatives, whose friends, whose had been shot, some of them had been injured, and they sang various Protestant hymns, which were all new to me. And just the idea that in my name, in the name of a united Ireland, in the name of some freedom we were going to win in the future, that this atrocity had occurred. I was just absolutely shocked by it. And I wanted to write down not how I felt, but actually who these people were, what they were saying, what they looked like, what the occasion was. But the other one, the very end of the book, I found myself in a place called Bessborough in South Armagh. And there were two men living in Bessborough, and I wanted to interview both of them. And I went, the first man wasn't in when I went there, but the second man was. I went to his door, and I've never seen anyone like him. I told him what I wanted, that he, let me think, get this right, in the winter of in the January of 1976, 12 men were coming home in a minibus from work. And they were coming towards Bessborough through a place called Kingsmills. And the minibus was stopped, and they weren't sure by who. As I say, there were so many armies. And they didn't realize at the beginning who it was. But they were all told to stand out of the minibus, and they did. Then they were told, we know there are 11 of you are Protestants, and one is a Catholic. Could the Catholics stand out? And the accents would have been just Northern Irish accents. They couldn't tell why the Catholic had to stand out, but they presumed it was so they could shoot the Catholics. And eventually the Catholics stood out. And he was a friend of theirs. He was their friend. He was with them. And eventually he stood out and he was told to run. And they presumed as he ran he would be shot. But no, they were shot. So the 11 Protestants were shot, 10 died and 1 survived. And the Catholic survived. Now you can imagine, this is 10 years later, and the Catholic, I come to his door and said, you know, I'm writing a book, I just wanted to talk to you about. And he said, I would never talk about that. And I said, I didn't know what to do. I mean, I'm not, you know, kicking in his door and saying, I need to get this information would not have helped. You know, I just stood back and he looked at me. And I said, did you think they were going to shoot you? It was sort of an insensitive question, but and he just looked at me and said, what would you have thought? So I realized, well, I don't want to disturb him anymore. So I thanked him and went away to the other man's house. It was Alan Black. And Alan Black was the one survivor on the Protestant side. And he said he couldn't talk. And then he said, just come in. There's a video I can show you. A film had been made about it for the 10th anniversary. But he hadn't watched it. So both of us sat and watched it. And, well, he was talking about the idea that he was seeing the children of his friends, these men, 10 men who were murdered, seeing their children in the town growing up, you know, obviously with no father, but just seeing them. He couldn't tell from their look, you know, what family they were from. And that was the legacy 10 years later. And it's still the legacy. And my job writing that book was to try and write down this as starkly as I could. Just like, don't say, I felt shock, don't do I felt anything. Just write down what Alan Black said. And then Alan Black did something extraordinary. He said to me, you know, I've talked enough about this, but could we just go out into the countryside and just do something else other than talk about this? I said, yeah. So he drove me out to a little bit of land he owned, and his son was out there already, and his son was learning to drive. He must have been about 15 or 16. He was trying to learn to drive, and he was reversing wrong. And it was a summer's evening, and the light was sort of fading, and the father just going to the car said, no, you do it this way. And it was that lovely, ordinary moment you get. You know, you could put it in a novel, maybe, or maybe not. It's a small drama of a father showing his son how to drive. And anyway, I was really, I was so overwhelmed by it. I had to just, you know, it wasn't my business to cry, but I thought, this is what the others have missed, you know. And that, as far as I'm concerned, Protestant, Catholic, Presbyterian, I don't care what anyone is, the idea of a united Ireland doesn't even bother. I mean, the idea that all of these large words were used to bring down these people and murder them and leave that legacy. So I was trying to write about individuals. So that was my first book, and it was published in 1987. I'm not sure it changed the world. You know, it didn't create instant peace. But I thought if enough of us did this from the South, if enough of us went up to become sort of witnesses to what was happening in the North, then that might bring not progress as much as some sense that this war was being fought in ways that the more you know about the individuals and the legacy, the more you might feel that it wasn't worth it, that it simply wasn't worth it. And that was my first book.
Just wondered if you could comment on Cool Park as a place in a house. I know you've written about it and the influence and everything.
Cool Park was the home of Lady Gregory. She was born, let me think, she was born in 1852. And when she was 27, she married a man who was 35 years her senior. He was called Sir William Gregory. And thus she became, I mean, instead of reading Henry James, honestly, this is true. Instead of reading Henry James, she was actually having lunch with him, saying, that Osmond, I didn't like him at all, the ending of the book. So she was moving, being with Mark Twain. And so he dies in about 1890, and leaving her a widow at the age of 40. So in 1892. And she had a choice in 1892 as to whether to become a widow, Lady Gregory in London, going to some dinner parties and not others. Instead, she decided to devote herself to the cause of Ireland, not to Irish freedom or Irish nationalism, but to some idea of ideals in Ireland. For example, Ireland had no national theatre, to see if that could be done. See if many of the ancient texts, meaning pre-Christian stories written down by early monks, meaning we got stuff from the 6th, 7th centuries, had not been translated. So she began to learn Irish. If you go into the New York Public Library, you can find her effort. You can see her papers. She's trying to learn Irish. She's using the Bible. What she does then is she goes to one of the islands off the west coast of Ireland and stays with the family, trying to perfect her Irish. In about 97, 98, she meets the poet W.B. Yeats, who's younger than her. She sees him at a party, and someone said about them, they were in the room when she saw him, as soon as she cast her terrible eye on him, I knew she would keep him. And so for the next 18 years, from 1898 to 1916, when Yeats gets his first house, he spends the summers in Lady Gregory's house. He has the master bedroom. He's head of the table. He drinks all her wine. And there's a letter saying, you're drinking all my wine. And he gets, of course, the run of her wonderful library. And the summers become long. I mean, they start in May often and end in October. The rest of the time he's in London as a poor young poet of the 1890s. And together they realised that they had to start a theatre. So they begin the Abbey Theatre, which is still there as the Irish National Theatre. She writes plays for that theatre. One of her plays has recently been performed again in that theatre. And so that the entire idea of that you establish a cultural nationalism or a cultural renaissance before you move into the political question of independence, that you set up a cultural independence, that really was her blueprint. And she's a bit of a heroine, really, and she used her house for that purpose. Anyone who wrote anything was invited there to stay there. It wasn't burned in any of the wars. It merely that her daughter-in-law ended up selling it, and the house was dismantled because, of course, the roof was worth money, and so was the so that you can just see, you can go there and just see where the house was. But what's marvelous is you can go and see the tree. If you were famous, she invited you to carve your initials on the tree. So you can see SOC, Sean O'Casey, WBY, George Bernard Shaw, GBS, so all the famous ones. And then you can see some locals have joined in, putting in their little initials. So it's sort of lovely. But the tree, strangely, the tree is still there, and all the woods that I was going to say she built a lot of trees, but she planted a lot of trees. And those, of course, forests are in Yeats's poetry, in The Seven Woods, and in others of his poems, that whole idea of what this house meant. This house is a sort of mecca of culture. And so that's my take on Coole Park. So I think we've come to an end. So thank you very much for coming, everybody, and thank you for having me.